Every once in a while, you just don't have time to do good work and you have to rely on hacky tricks. Well, I've got 10 of those for you, so let's get into it. So some of these tricks are mine that I've picked up over the years, but actually most of them came from other motion designers on Twitter. When you're working professionally, sometimes you just have to work really fast and you need to pull from your bag of tricks and just get it done. And so these are 10 things that I've used over the years and other motion designers have used that can help you make your work a little bit better, help you plus it, as we like to say, really quickly. All right, hacky move number 1. And this comes from Logan Braun. He says, optical flares by Video Copilot. Logan, I love that. All right. So here we've got a pretty simple setup for, some kind of title design. And the design is nice, but it'd be cool if we could plus it a little bit. So we are definitely gonna add a little bit of optical flare here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a new layer, black solid. I'm gonna rename this flare. I'm gonna go up to effect and I'm gonna choose my dear friend, optical flares. When I open optical flares, it really is like slipping into a warm bath. I have, of course, all of the add-on packs that you can get for optical flares because I'm lazy. So some of these things are a little over the top, but I like ones that have all of these nice little chromatic aberrations, the dust, all that kind of stuff. The actual flare itself, sometimes I'll turn that off because I think that can be a little heavy-handed unless you are actually using this like a lens flare. But what's cool about this plugin is you can click your mouse, you can kind of move these things around and see how they're going to move. Wow, this one is really crazy. And we can go with something a little bit subtle like this one. And the only thing I don't love about it is the really, really bright spot right in the middle. So what I can do is just come here and hide that. And now I've got this cool element. So now I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna hit OK. Here it is. There's a few ways you can use optical flares. One way is to go down here to render mode and say on transparent. And now you've got this really nice kind of subtle overlay looking lens flare, but sometimes I want it to be a little more over the top. So I'm just gonna go ahead and set this to add mode. And it's subtle, it just kind of makes it feel a little bit brighter, more saturated over the image. Now, if I position this thing right here, I think that's a good spot for it. It looks pretty cool. But the thing about lens flares is they're really, really cool when they're moving. So I'm gonna do something really, really simple here. I'm gonna go into this background pre-comp here. And just looking through these layers real quick, I've got this matte layer that's kind of like a letterbox. Everything else is making up the background. So I'm gonna parent these two layers to the base layer. And I'm gonna put an ever so subtle scale on here. I'm just gonna knock this up a little bit like that. Cool. And then back in my main comp, I'm gonna preview this. Yep, I feel like that's kind of the right amount of movement. And so now I could get really fancy and create some sort of expression rig to tie the position of this lens flare to this exact spot, but I actually don't need to do that because this is such a simple move. All I'm gonna do is come over here and keyframe the position. Then I'm gonna go to the last frame and I'm gonna move this right over that lamp. And so now it's nice and subtle, but it's tracking to it and it's giving just a little bit of movement. I'd like to give it a little bit of something else, so I'm also gonna keyframe the scale. And what the scale does is it basically just scales all of the elements up or down from the center point of the lens flare. And so I'm just gonna scale this up a little bit as we move. Cool, that's nice and subtle. I like that, it plussed it up just a little bit. And now I'm gonna hop in here. I'm just gonna grab this letterbox and I'm gonna copy it, turn it off in here and paste it up here so that it crops out the lens flare. Fantastic. So that is trick 1. Trick 2, diffusion on a budget. So this comes from Twitter user AE Cartographer, who told me, subtle fast box blur on an adjustment layer with opacity set to like 15. I love it, let's try it out. So I think I'm gonna leave the diffusion just over the shot here. I don't think I want it over the type. So let's go into the pre-comp and I'm gonna follow this recipe exactly. I actually kind of do this a different way, but I wanna see how this works. So first, I'm gonna make a new layer and I'm gonna call this diffusion on a budget. I'm gonna set that to be an adjustment layer and I'm gonna go up to effect, blur, fast box blur. Now, he said subtle, so I'm gonna start with like 1 or 2. Let's try 2, okay? And then the trick to this is you set the opacity to 15, he said. All right, so let's do a little before and after here. So this is without and with. I think that might be too subtle. So I'm gonna bump this up to 50. Yeah, you can see, so before and after, it just makes it slightly more filmic. And I bet I could even get some interesting effects if I play with the transfer mode here. What if I set this to screen? Ooh, I like that. It kind of brightened it up a little too much. So now I'm gonna bring the opacity down to maybe, I don't know, 30. And so now we've got before after, just a subtle bit of haze, glow, and voila, we've got a little bit more atmosphere, but I think we could go even further. So let's go to tip number 3, grain as far as the eye can see. This one comes from Simon Shu, who's a man of few words. All he said was grain, and I get it. I get you, Simon. So I think I would like to put grain over this entire thing except for the letterbox. So what I'm gonna do here is add an adjustment layer above the lens flare. So I'm gonna make a new layer, I'm gonna name it grain, and I'm going to make it an adjustment layer. Now there's a few ways to add grain in After Effects. There's actually the grain effect. Why don't we try that first? So that's just effect, noise, add grain. And by default, it only adds grain in this little white square. This is like an artifact from After Effects being run on computers that were really slow back in the day. And so it would just do a little bit of grain while you tweaked it and dialed in the settings. We don't need that anymore. I'm just gonna set this to final output so I can see grain across the whole thing. I tend to think the default grain settings make the grain a little bit too big. And there's a whole bunch of presets here, but I usually just stick with the default and dial it in the way I want. So I'm gonna change the size down to 0.5. Just cut the size of that grain in half. And then the intensity is 1 right now. I'm also gonna cut that in half. And so if we zoom in here and I turn the grain off and on, you can see that even on the still, it makes a pretty big difference. So let me RAM preview that. The only thing I don't like about grain is the effect it has on your render times. And so I'm gonna show you a little trick. Instead of using the grain effect on this adjustment layer, I'm gonna use a different effect, and this is gonna be Noise HLS Auto. HLS stands for Hue, Lightness, and Saturation, and this is an effect that lets you add noise to specific parts of the image channels. And I usually use it on the lightness channel very subtly, and this renders way faster than grain. So I'll crank this up just so you can see what it looks like, right? It adds a lot of noise if you want it to, and you can change the noise type from uniform to squared, which gives you a little bit of a different grain pattern, or grain, which looks a little bit more like actual grain, and it also opens up the grain size property. But I'm just gonna use uniform, and I'm gonna do lightness at like 2%, all right? So again, subtle, and that might be too subtle, and maybe for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll do it a little bit heavier. Maybe I'll double that, we'll go to 4, okay? So before, after, all right, you can see the difference there. And you can see how much faster this renders than the actual grain effect. And for most purposes, it's fine. Maybe the grain effect looks a little bit more natural, a little bit nicer, and there's some nice options where you can have different amounts of grain in different color channels, but let's be honest, most of us aren't gonna notice the difference. So I use this effect all the time. The 4th trick is Chromatic Aberration, and this was recommended by Fede Puopolo. I'm sure I butchered that name, I apologize, but you are absolutely right. We need Chromatic Aberration. If you don't know what chromatic aberration is, it's sort of this artifact that happens sometimes when you shoot things with a camera where the red, blue, and green channels don't line up perfectly. And you get this little bit of colored fringing as those channels kind of are misaligned. And it looks really cool. So there is actually a very old tutorial on this channel where I show you how to manually create chromatic aberration, but of course, there's a much better way. What you're gonna wanna do is go to plugineverything.com and download their quick chromatic aberration 2 plugin for free. Plugin Everything make amazing plugins. They're really fast. They always look really good. They're cool guys, and it's a free download. So thank you guys for putting this together. It makes it so much easier. So I'm gonna grab my grain adjustment layer, duplicate that, bring it underneath the flare and rename it chromatic. Then I can delete these effects on it, come up to Effect, Plugin Everything, Chromatic Aberration. And I'm gonna zoom in so you can see what this is doing. If I adjust the position and then I slowly lower it, you can see it's taking the red, blue, and green channels and it's spreading, right now, the red and blue channels apart from the green. And there's some different settings. I could have it split the red and the green. I could have it split the green and the blue, and it just gives you slightly different looks. But the key with this is you wanna be subtle. So a value of 1 is subtle. If I go up to 2, it's already starting to create like a kind of a weird, it's almost like you're drunk or something. I don't know, I've never been drunk, I wouldn't know. But if I set that to 1, that is kind of subtle. And if I just do a quick before and after, let me turn that off, turn it back on, it looks kind of nice. And I like how the grain ends up on top of it. So chromatic aberration, it tends to blur the image slightly, and then the grain tends to make it feel a little bit sharper. Quick RAM preview, and yeah, it's subtle, but it's just starting to make the image look a little bit more natural. And it's sometimes hard to tell when you have these subtle effects kind of layered on like this until you do it before and after. So here is the scene before we did anything to it, and here is the way it's looking now. right? When you add on all these things, it does add up and make it more visually interesting and definitely different. All right, let's move on to our fifth hacky trick. This one comes from Adam Moorer, and he suggests using a blur vignette, which is very close to a darkening vignette, which is my go-to hacky trick, which I'm gonna show you in a minute. So what is a blur vignette? Well, the way I interpret this is it's the edges of the frame getting blurry because of some lens imperfection. So how do we simulate that? Well, we're gonna go into the background layer, and I'm gonna show you first how not to do it. So don't do it this way. I'm gonna make a new layer and I'm gonna label it don't. I'm gonna put just a standard Gaussian blur on here. Make that into an adjustment layer. Make sure repeat edge pixels are on so you don't get the weird fringing around the edges. And then let's blur this, I don't know, something like that. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab the ellipse tool to draw a mask right in the middle of this, maybe something like that. I'm gonna hit F so I can feather that mask a lot, and then I'll invert it so that now the edges of the frame are blurred and the center isn't. Now, this kind of works, and on some images you can get away with it, but here's the problem. If I really crank up this blur like this, and we go into where the edges of this mask sit, you'll see what's going on here. What's happening is you're getting a blurred copy of the image underneath the adjustment layer, and then you're seeing through that blurred layer to a crisp, sharp layer. It's not acting the way a lens does, where you get this gradual blur effect. You're basically seeing both the sharp version and the blurred version at the same time, and it doesn't look right. So how do we get that nice gradient of blur? Well, I just gave you a hint when I said gradient. Here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna make a new layer. I'm gonna name it gradient. And what I'm gonna do is just generate a gradient ramp. You're gonna wanna set this to radial ramp, and I'm gonna move this point right to the middle. I'm gonna zoom out and I'm gonna grab the ending point and I'm gonna pull this way out like this, okay? And so I'm gonna use this gradient as a map to blur my image. So the way that works is you turn off your gradient layer. You don't need to see it. Now you make a new layer and I'm gonna call it lens blur. And I'm gonna go up and add the camera lens blur effect. Now, this effect, by the way, it can be a little bit of a render pig. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but I like it. And so if it's taking too long to render, if your computer's older, you can also use the compound blur effect. It doesn't give you as nice of a blur, but it will work in a pinch. But I like to use camera lens blur. What you wanna do is change the blur map setting to your gradient layer, and you have to make sure that you also change this setting here, because by default, it's only looking at the source of that layer, which is just a black solid. There is no gradient on it. You want it to also look at effects and masks, and so now it's taking into account the gradient that you've added. So if I zoom in here and I start to turn up the blur radius, I'll just crank it up really high. You can see now the center of the frame is in focus and the outside is really blurry, but because this is the camera lens blur effect, this is something compound blur won't do, is you start getting these nice little bokeh. And you can actually change the shape of the bokeh. By default, they're hexagons, which looks cool. You could also click decagon, which makes them basically look like circles. And then if you want something really kind of funky, you can choose triangles. And you know, it kind of looks like you're looking through a kaleidoscope toy or something. But I'm gonna leave them as decagons because I think that looks the most natural. Now, I wanna be able to control this blur a little bit more. I'd like much more of this to be in focus, but I actually like this really heavy defocus effect on the edges. So how can I control that? Well, first I am gonna turn down the blur radius a little bit, maybe a little bit more, 20. So that outside edge there, that is as blurry as I want anything to get. But I wanna be able to control where the blur begins and ends. And so the way I can do that is by going to my gradient layer and adding one more effect. I'm gonna add a color correction levels effect. And let me turn off my lens blur layer for a minute and turn the gradient layer back on so you can see what this is doing. Everywhere that's black is gonna be in focus. Everywhere that's white is gonna be defocused. So I'd like more control over how the black and the white get spaced out. So by using the levels effect and focusing on the top bar, the input bar, I can basically get more black pixels and more white pixels or less white pixels by adjusting these. And I can move the midpoint of the gradient by moving this middle arrow, the gamma arrow. So I'm gonna start with the black. This is the black input. And if I click it and I drag it to the right, you can see how it's expanding the black out. The levels effect in a nutshell, it's telling After Effects that below this level, make it black. Even though it's not black, if it's below this certain value, I want it to be black. And I can also do the same thing with white. If I pull the white input this way, it will make more pixels white. And then if I adjust the gamma, you can see it sort of adjusts, I guess for lack of a better word, the feather of the gradient. And so now I'll turn this off, I'll turn the lens blur back on, and you can see now I can actually interactively kind of move this around and adjust it until it looks the way I want. I might bring the black input back here just a little bit so I get a little bit more blur in the middle, but that's looking pretty good to me. Let's go back to the night scene. So now I'm RAM previewing and you can see how slow it's going. That's because of the camera lens blur. It is a pretty render heavy effect, but it looks so beautiful. It's kind of worth it. So I just rendered this little part just so you could kind of see the subtle movement of it. I kind of want to throw in a bonus hack here because this shot is kind of perfect for it. So this one isn't going to count towards the 10. You're going to give me a freebie. So here is the trick. We've got this scene kind of scaling up at us like this, and it looks very flat in 2D. Because it is flat in 2D, but there's a trick. I'm gonna turn the lens blur off for a moment. I'm gonna add another adjustment layer and I'm gonna call this optics. I'm gonna set this to an adjustment layer and I'm gonna use a very old effect. This is Effect, Distort, Optics Compensation. Now, this effect is primarily used to remove lens distortion and then reintroduce lens distortion when you're integrating CG elements with a photographed plate. But you can also use it to simulate lens distortion in something that doesn't have it. So you'll see if I come up here to field of view and I start messing with this, it starts kind of curling the image like this, kind of wrapping it around a lens. That's not what I want. I actually want the opposite of that. So if I say reverse lens distortion, now you can see what it's doing. It's kind of pulling the edges of the frame towards me and leaving the center where it is. And so what's gonna happen now as I kind of scrub through this is a subtle effect where as the image scales up, the edges of it are gonna move faster than the center, which will kind of sort of give it some fake perspective. It's pretty subtle, but if you stare at the center of that image, you'll notice that the edges are actually moving a little bit faster. And just to drive it home, I can ramp up the field of view just for a minute so you can see what it really looks like. It's a pretty cool effect, very useful. But that's too much. Let's set that back. I don't know, maybe we'll split the difference. Set it to 75. We'll go back to the night scene. And let's RAM preview. All right, and here is our finished comp. It's nothing that crazy, but if you think about where we started and where we ended up, we really didn't do a whole lot. We just added some effects, did some little tricks, and in the end, it makes the whole thing a lot more cinematic, more interesting, without having to think too hard and actually design something or animate something complicated. Now let's move on to another example, and I'm gonna show you 5 more hacks. But before I do that, I wanna tell you about our free 10-day class, The Path to MoGraph. This class is a really awesome way to dip your toes into the world of motion design. If you've never been a professional motion designer, if you're really into this stuff and you want to know what it's like to make a living doing this, to work in a studio, or to take a professional project from start to finish, this class will show you all of those things and more. So click the link in the description and enjoy our free 10-day class, The Path to MoGraph. All right. Back to the hacks. I've got a different setup for these next examples because I think these hacks work a little bit better on things that have shapes and are a little bit more abstract looking. So what I have here is a really simple scene with a bunch of shapes in it, and they're just kind of randomly entering the frame. And the goal is to get from this shot to this shot, which has our logo reveal. This is a pretty standard MoGraph thing that we all have to do. So how can we use our bag of tricks to get there a little bit faster? So here are those 2 comps sequenced together with the rough timing of what we want here. And it's just kind of flat and boring. So let's fix that with what I think may be the best hack of all time, the vignette. You know, little known fact, my nickname at the studio I used to run in Boston was Joey Vignetti because I kind of look Italian even though I'm not, but also because I would use a vignette on literally everything. So what is a vignette? Well, it's probably easier if I show you. I am just gonna add a new solid layer called Viggy for vignette over the entire comp. And the easiest way to add a vignette is to just double click this ellipse tool, which will add an elliptical mask that fits perfectly within the bounds of that solid. Then hit F, invert the mask, and feather it, and that's it. And then you can dial in the opacity to taste. That is your basic vignette. So it's essentially a darkening of the edges of the frame. And what it's really doing is it's creating brighter values in the center of the frame, darker values on the outside, which draws your eye naturally into the middle of the frame. And it feels kind of nice. It's kind of like a nice design trick to draw your eye right to the center. But doing a vignette this way is kind of boring. And I think you can get a better result if you do it a little differently. So we'll turn the opacity back up. It's heavily feathered, so we'll set that to 300 and leave it there. But what I want to do is just double click the shape, hold Command and Shift, and just bring it into the center just ever so slightly. And I actually want to use this as an adjustment layer. So what effect do I want on there? Well, I usually use the levels effect, because what the levels effect is going to do, it's going to take the colors that are already in the comp and darken those versus adding black to them, because it's not the same thing. So if I grab the black level and I bring it down, you'll see that it almost feels like it's burning the edges of the frame. It just looks a little neater to me, but it's not darkening it enough. So the other thing I'm going to do is grab this arrow. So this black and white gradient bar on the levels effect, that's the output bar. It's basically saying what is the brightest pixel that you'll let me output and the darkest pixel. And so I want to lower the white output so it's just darkening everything. So if I do this, you can see it's darkening it. Now I don't want to do it too much because it'll start to muddy the colors. So just a little bit. And then I could also mess with this gamma. And usually by playing around with the gamma, you'll get either a more or less saturated vignette. And I want a little bit less, all right? So if I turn this on and off, that's a nice subtle joy vignette right there. But this is still boring. We need some more tricks, don't we? All right, what's next? Number 7, Wiggle Be Thy Name from Cybrand Klomstra. Great name, by the way. Who says, my name is Wiggle? No, sir, your name is Cybrand, but I like where your head's at. So Wiggle, what is Wiggle? Well, I assume he's referring to the Wiggle expression, which basically just wiggles layers. It does exactly what it sounds like. It can also wiggle properties, but in this case, I think it'd be enough to just give each of these layers a little bit of life, some subtle movement. So how do we do that? So you can see that this comp has a whole bunch of layers in it, and I'm already thinking ahead. I'm thinking, all right, there's a ton of layers. If I put a wiggle expression on all of them and then I change my mind and I want to have them wiggle a little bit more, a little bit less, I don't want to have to go change them in every single layer. So I think I'm just going to build a really quick little expression control, and I'll teach you how to do it. So what I'm going to do is add a new layer that is a null object. Null objects by themselves don't do anything. They don't render, they don't create any pixels. You can attach things to them, but they can also be good placeholders for controls if you're building expression rigs. So when I apply the wiggle expression to the position of these layers, I'm gonna need 2 arguments. I'm gonna need to know the wiggle amount, how many pixels am I wiggling, and the wiggle frequency, how often am I moving. So I want controls for both of those. So I'm gonna go up to the effect menu and pick expression controls, slider control. This is probably the most basic kind of control. It's essentially just a number you can slide up and down. And so I'm gonna name this one amount, and this one frequency. So now I'll just pick the first layer, which happens to be this one. I'm gonna hit P to expose the position properties. It's got keyframes on it, but that's okay because the expression will basically work on top of those keyframes. So if I hold Option and click on the stopwatch, it opens up the expressions editor. Now I know the wiggle expression, but if you don't use expressions all the time, that's okay. You can click on this arrow and it'll open up this little menu that has every expression pretty much that you can use listed out here. And so you can actually just kind of browse. It's almost like you're shopping. And so if I go down here to property, you'll see here is wiggle, and it tells you which arguments you need. Argument is just a fancy term for property, right? So I'm gonna type in wiggle, and then it's gonna want the frequency and the amplitude of the wiggle, basically the amount. So I'm just gonna click this. Now there's all these other options here, octaves and multiples and time, all this. I'm gonna delete those. You don't actually need those. You only need these 2, okay? So wiggle frequency and amplitude. So what you could do is actually just put numbers in here, right? So this would be 2 times per second by 2 pixels. 2 pixels isn't very much, so we could say 20 pixels. And then I hit return. And now if I preview this, you'll see that that layer is wiggling around after it stops moving. Great. Now it's moving too much for my liking, and I'd like to be able to control that without having to come in here and change these numbers every time. Here's the way you do it. You click on your null so that the effect controls appear up here in wherever your effect control window is. Then I can click in this expression box, and where it says 2, I'm gonna delete. So remember, that's the frequency. And now I'm gonna grab this pick whip tool, and I'm gonna pick whip up to the frequency slider. Then I'm gonna come over here to the 20, and I'm gonna delete that, and I'm gonna use that same pick whip up to the amount. And then I can hit return. And so now whatever I set these amounts to, that is actually what that wiggle expression is gonna use. So if I set the amount to like 50 and the frequency to 5, right, some really big amount, that is what it's going to use. It's gonna wiggle around like crazy. And so now if I want every other layer to also use that expression, I can click on position here. I can go up to edit and say copy expression only, so it doesn't copy those keyframes over. Select every other layer really quickly and paste. And now they all have that wiggle expression on them. And if I play it, you'll see that right now, they're all moving around like crazy. That's too much. I'm no expert, but that's too much. So let's tone that down. The amount can actually be fairly high. It could be 10 or it could be 20, but the frequency is really the thing that you notice the most on the wiggle expression. So if I lower this really low, like 0.25, that means we're only gonna do this every 4 seconds. So it's gonna take 4 seconds to wiggle those 20 pixels. That's pretty slow. So now it's gonna feel a little bit more like a subtle drifting, right? And this is more what I'm talking about. It just basically keeps things alive instead of just landing and being totally still. It feels like there's a little bit of something going on. I could really easily apply the same setup to this comp as well. I just copy and paste the null object in there. And as long as it has the exact same layer name, I can also then come back here. I can grab this expression. I'm gonna control click it this time and say copy expression only. Come over here and paste onto the layers that have the keyframes, and now they have the same drift. So we go back to our final comp and we see what we've got, and it's looking a little bit better because now things are moving, there's a little more life to them. Really hacky, really easy, hey, but it works. All right, another hack, number 8. This one comes from Ricard Bengston, and this is the old zoom cut. Let me show you what he's talking about. At this point in the animation right here, when we cut to the next shot, it's just kind of boring, nothing really happens. So I'm gonna do 2 things. One, I'm gonna come here and I'm gonna hit the asterisk key to put a marker right where that cut should happen. And then I'm gonna move this layer backwards so that there's a little bit of motion already happening when we cut to it. Maybe a frame or 2 back, there we go. Then I'm going to hide this up until that point, right? So now I'm cutting on action. That's not what Ricard is talking about, but you need to have some action even on the first frame for this trick to really work. Now we need to decide how quickly this transition is gonna happen. This is a 24 frames per second comp, so I think slightly less than a second's probably good. So why don't we say 20 frames? Let's try that. So I'm gonna go backwards 10 frames, and then I'm gonna go into this comp. And what I want to do is basically right before we cut, I want a quick zoom in or zoom out. And I feel like zooming out will probably work a little bit better. Now, what's the best way to do that? I could make everything a 3D layer, put a camera in there and then move the camera. That's one way to do it. But because everything's 2D and flat, I kind of don't need to bother with that. What I'm gonna do, I already have a null object in here with controls on it. What I can do is I can select every single layer except the bottom one, which is the background. There's one layer in here that's parented, so I don't want to select that one. And I'm going to parent all of these to this null object. And now, if I just put a scale keyframe on that null object, and I go forward 10 frames, and I scale it down, it will look like they're zooming out. And I want it to zoom out enough that it's pretty noticeable. Now, the key to this is having really snappy movement. That's not snappy, okay? I'm no expert, that's not snappy. So what you need to do is easy ease these keyframes and go into your best friend in After Effects, the graph editor. Now, if you've taken Animation Bootcamp, you know I prefer the value graph, especially for things like this, because it's just a little bit more intuitive. And so what I'm thinking is I want this thing to start really slow and then boom, I want it to go really fast towards the end. And you know my motto, steepness equals speed on the value graph. So I'm gonna grab this keyframe right here and I'm gonna yank this sucker out this way. Then I'm gonna grab this one and point it almost straight up like that, okay? So now if I RAM preview this, there's a jerk there. And I don't mean, you know, like a jerk, like a little jerk. So now let's go to this comp and we'll go to the first frame and we'll do the same thing. I'm gonna grab all of the layers that aren't parented to something else. I'm gonna parent them to this. I'm gonna go forward 10 frames, and this is where I want it to land. So I'm gonna put a scale keyframe there. Now, if you think about it, we were zooming out from the last shot, so it makes sense that we would zoom into this one. So if I go back to the first frame, I'm gonna scale it up by 20%. I'm gonna easy ease it, go into the graph editor, and I'm gonna apply the same animation curve, but in reverse. So at the beginning, I want it basically pointed straight up like that, and then I want a really hard ease at the end, like that. Now, if you remember, I trimmed off the beginning of this shot, okay? I need the animation to start here, so if I double click this, now my playhead's in the right spot, and that's actually where I want these scale keyframes to start from there. Cool. Now, it's really kind of hard to see what's going on. Let's take a look and see how this feels. Now you can see right at that moment, right when the shapes start to push back and we're zooming out, it does feel cool. It does actually help motivate the transition a little bit. But when we come into this shot, there's really not enough going on. There's not enough detail in the frame for us to even catch that we're zooming at all. So there's a couple things we can do. So one thing we could try is just scaling in much further in the beginning, right? And seeing if that does the trick. Let me make sure my animation curves. So my animation curves got screwed up. Let me fix that real quick. And let's see how that feels. The problem is it's happening so fast, you can't really see anything. So I think what we're gonna need to do to make this trick work is we're gonna need to change the animation a little bit. I am going to remove the animation from the square so that that square is just in place where it's gonna be. And I'm gonna pair with that scale, I'm gonna pair a little bit of position. It's like wine and cheese. So in the beginning, I want that square to be a little bit further in the frame like this. Let's separate these dimensions, make this a little bit easier. I don't need the Y position, I just need the X. And what this is gonna help with is basically giving us a little bit of a visual reference so that we can actually feel that zoom a little bit more. There we go. Now it feels a little bit more zoomy. And when you do little moves like that right before a cut, it helps motivate that cut. It feels a little bit better. So that's the trick. But there's another trick that I think pairs nicely with this one. This is another one of mine. Gratuitous use of texture. Texture can be useful for a lot of reasons, so here's one reason. This composition, even with my beautiful vignette on it, is still a little bit flat, and so adding texture to it can just break it up visually and make it a little bit cooler to look at. So I have a Texture Labs paper texture from texturelabs.com. It's one of my favorite texture websites. Almost all of them are free, it's amazing, check it out, link in the description. And all I'm gonna do is take this paper texture and I'm gonna stick it right underneath my Viggy. And so I'm gonna go into the first shots pre-comp here, and I'm gonna place that paper texture on top of all of the artwork, and I'm gonna parent it to my null. All right, and then I'm gonna scale it down. I don't want it all the way scaled down, because I do kind of like having the feel of being close to the paper. I think that's kind of nice. And then I'm gonna play with transfer modes. Now, one I like a lot generally is overlay. Because what overlay does is it basically takes pixels that are darker than gray and it darkens things, and it takes pixels that are lighter than gray and brightens things. And that works really well when your design has a lot of mid-tones to it. But this one doesn't, it's very, very bright. So it may actually work better to use one of the darkening modes like multiply. And you can see that's pretty heavy-handed there. It actually kind of gave it this weird yellow cast, but that is why God created more effects in After Effects. And by God, I mean Adobe. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a color correction levels effect to this. And the white input, if I push this to the left, you'll see it's gonna start to get rid of some of that texture because we are in multiply mode. And so now that's pretty subtle. And if I push the black, it's gonna bring up some of that texture. Now that's a little much there, but maybe something in there. Now, if I before and after this, it is doing something a little strange to the color. So why don't I also go ahead and add a color correction, hue and saturation, and just desaturate this thing. So now there's no risk of it changing the color. And you can see if I turn that hue and saturation on and off, it's really subtle. It may be hard to see on the screen capture, but it's basically taking away that yellow cast that this texture is giving it. And so now here's before and after. Now, the cool thing is, I'm gonna RAM preview this, that texture moves with everything. So again, it's another visual reference point for motion. Now, I do need to go to this last keyframe here and make sure that at that moment in time, this texture doesn't start to show its edge or something, and it doesn't, but I'm getting this weird little spot down here, which caught my eye. So I'm just gonna nudge this over and find sort of a less noticeable part of the texture. There we go, I'm digging that. I can then copy this layer, bring it over here to the title resolve, and I'll just do the exact same thing. Parent it to the null, go to the beginning to make sure that, you know, we're not seeing any weird spots, go to the end to make sure that we're not seeing the edges. And so now this shot also has another visual reference to let us know that we're zooming. And so now when I play this down, you're gonna feel that zoom a lot more because of that texture. Now this texture is pretty heavy-handed actually, and that is something that I am generally okay with, but I'm gonna go ahead and turn the opacity down to 50%. One of the things you have to be careful of when you're using hacky tricks like this is not overdoing it, because you're usually doing this when you're tired and you kind of want the job to be over, and that's when you start to get a little not subtle, and you want to be subtle. Now that we have the texture on there, I'm not sure that we still need this exposition move. I think that that might just be adding one thing too many. So let's try it without. Yeah, I'm digging that. Okay, great. So I think we got time for one more trick. And this trick comes from one of my favorite animators, Mr. Fraser Davidson of Cub Studios. Ladies and gentlemen, give the man a round of applause. So Fraser gives me this cryptic advice. Fraser on twos. What does that mean? That's a great question. So back in the before times when people used pencil and paper to draw every single frame of animation, film projectors ran at 24 frames per second, the same as they do now. But that's a lot of frames to draw for 1 second of animation. And it turns out that you can get away with drawing half that many and it still feels pretty smooth. And so if you're drawing on every other frame, that's called drawing on twos because it's every 2 frames. Now, in reality, animators will sometimes draw on ones and sometimes draw on twos, and you can kind of play around with the timing of it. But when you animate something in After Effects, by default, it's gonna animate on every single frame of your comp. This is a 24 frames per second comp. So that means every single frame, 24 times per second, this thing is changing. And so that's what gives it this really kind of smooth feel. Sometimes that's what you want. That's almost never what Fraser wants. If you look at Fraser's work, everything's animated on twos. Everything has this effect that kind of attempts to make it look more hand-drawn. And frankly, that is a lot of what we do as After Effects artists. We try to take these perfectly pixel perfect animations and mess them up so that it does look a little bit more hand-drawn because that's just generally more visually pleasing to us. So there's many ways to make this look like it was done on twos, but the easiest way is you just add an adjustment layer over the whole thing, and I'm gonna call this on twos, make it an adjustment layer, and then go up to Effect, Time, Posterize Time. And that's it. And then you just go up and tell it which frame rate you'd like. So I'm gonna type in 12, and if I page up, page down, you'll see now it's only showing me every other frame. It's pretty interesting, right? There's something about it, and you'll see a lot of motion design animated on twos like this. It just gives it a little bit more of that vintage hand-drawn look. Okay, fine, one more bonus hack, and it's only out of respect to Fraser because he does this all the time too. So here's what this hack does. This hack basically makes things look even more hand-drawn. And it's gonna do that by subtly distorting the artwork on every single frame. So to do this, I'm gonna make a new layer and we're gonna call this Turbulent, and you'll see why in a minute. I'm gonna turn that into an adjustment layer and we're gonna add the effect Turbulent Displace, which is in the Distort menu. There we go. Okay, now it's important that the Turbulent Displace effect is not on top of the texture because we don't want the texture to move. We don't want it to look like the paper is warping, only that the artwork is warping. And the reason is it's gonna make it look almost like, not really, but a little bit like we're drawing every single frame, making it a little bit imperfect. We're not getting the edges exactly the same on each frame. That's kind of what we're simulating. So the Turbulent Displace effect, you'll see the default settings are really, really heavy, right? We want this to be pretty subtle. So what I'm first gonna do is set the size way down, okay? Because I really just want it to look almost like a marker's bleeding onto the paper or just slight little imperfections in the strokes of, you know, the artist's pen or something like that. Then we can dial down the amount until it's just barely noticeable, maybe something like that. And I'll zoom in so you can see this a little bit better, but if you look at the distortion on this bullseye piece of art right here, if I turn Turbulent Displace off and on, you can see the difference, and that's it, okay? Now, if I just leave it like that and I render this, it already helps, but it actually works better if the displacement is animating a little bit, so that it looks like on every frame, there was basically a new drawing created. And the easiest way to do that is with this evolution option. So if I zoom in to, say, this circle shape here, and I start rotating this evolution property, watch what happens. It's subtle, but you can see it kind of boiling a little bit and just the edges move a little bit. And to make it a little bit easier to see, I can turn the size up a little bit more for you. And so what I want is for this evolution to constantly just be changing almost randomly so that every frame's a little bit different. Now, if I come up to the evolution property, hold Option and click, it will apply an expression to it. And I want to change that expression to time. There it is, time. So what time does is it tells After Effects to replace the word time with the actual time of the comp in numbers, right? So if I click off of this, you'll see that right now the value of the evolution is 0 because the time is also 0. But if I go forward to, let's say, 2 seconds, so the time is 2 seconds, the evolution is now 2 degrees. So this is a way you can have a property constantly increase. Now, that's really, really slow. That's not gonna work. But now we can use some simple math. We could say time times, I don't know, 1,000. And so now it's gonna rotate by 1,000 degrees every second, which is pretty quick. So if I zoom out and I play this, you'll see, especially in that moment when everything kind of pauses right at the end before it zooms backwards, right? Like look at this shape. You can see the edges kind of moving. Now, they're moving pretty smoothly right now, and that kind of gives the effect away. So one thing I could do is just increase that amount that we're multiplying the times by. So instead of 1,000, do 10,000. Now it's going to be happening much, much faster. And you see now it feels a lot more noisy, which is kind of what we're going for. It doesn't look great yet, but watch this. When I go back into the final comp with the posterized time effect on it, now that is going to give it a more hand-drawn look. All right, and let me go ahead and apply the exact same effect on the resolve shot here. And remember, I want this below the texture, so it's not wiggling that texture. Cool, so now you can really clearly see what that effect is doing. And you should, of course, spend some time playing with the turbulent displace amounts and the wiggle amounts and getting things to look exactly the way you want. I'm gonna lower this just a little bit more, try to get this a little bit more subtle. I'm using these settings now, 13 and 3. This is really where you wanna spend your time. Once you have this stuff set up, you wanna just kind of dial it in to taste. But once you've done this enough times, you kind of start to get a little bit of a sixth sense about what settings to use to get a certain result, to go a little more heavy-handed or a little more subtle. You now have some new tools in your toolbox that you can whip out anytime you are working on a simple client project and it's late and you're banging your head against the keyboard or your Magic Mouse. Because I did actually get some crap for using a Magic Mouse on one of my last tutorials, which I thought was funny. Don't judge me. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. And if you liked this, if you thought this was helpful, do me a favor and smash the out of that subscribe button and the like button as well. Please leave a comment. Let me know which tip was your favorite, or if you have a tip that you didn't see in here, and maybe we'll do another round of these because there really are a million of these. That's it. Thank you so much. Have an awesome day.